My name is Claire, I'm 38, and I'm an entrepreneur. An uncomfortable silence hung heavy in the conference room when Mark announced my dismissal. You no longer fit our vision, he said, his dismissive tone ringing in my ears. It was as if he were dismissing a rebellious subject, ignoring my potential. I knew my ambitious work style threatened his control, and that was the reason behind his decision. As he spoke, I looked at the faces around the table, each expression reflecting weakness and complicity. Tiffany, his loyal accomplice, watched with a mixture of relief and insecurity. The feeling of being on the verge of victory dissipated, but I was keenly aware of the opportunities I had created during my time there. The experience and knowledge I had accumulated over years working in the tech industry far surpassed anything they could imagine. Mark and Tiffany were guardians of a status quo I had repeatedly challenged. The phrase echoing in my mind, they underestimated my ambition. Now I call the shots, became increasingly clear. I had identified their weaknesses, Mark's fear of losing control and Tiffany's insecurity about her position, both uniting against what they didn't understand. I mentally wrote down everyone's weaknesses, observing each nervous glance they exchanged. Although the dismissal was a blow, I didn't let it get me down. On the contrary, this betrayal would be the driving force that would transform my indignation into a strategy for revenge. My experience in business management and product development hadn't been in vain, and now was the time to use that knowledge to turn the tables. I felt a flame of determination ignite within me. Leaving the room, each step became lighter. If they thought they had put me in a vulnerable position, they were wrong. I wasn't a product of imposed limitations. I was a work in progress, full of ideas ready to be explored. I began to formulate a plan to transform this pain into motivation. I wouldn't become a victim. Instead, I would use this betrayal as fuel. Revenge, I reflected, isn't just about destroying. It's about creating something more meaningful. From that moment on, I decided my focus would be on building my own story, where I would be the protagonist and where all the rules would be rewritten. The journey that would follow would become an affirmation of my worth and a warning to those who doubted me. They didn't yet know this was just the first page of a new chapter. The moments leading up to my dismissal were like flashes from a movie now, rapidly playing in my mind. The meetings, the ideas I passionately presented, a new proposal for an innovative product that I knew could revolutionize our business line. Mark, sitting at the head of the table, had listened with a mask of indifference that concealed his true concern, the fear of being surpassed by someone as ambitious as me. I remember one meeting in particular. I had prepared a detailed presentation with charts and market analyses that clearly showed how we could conquer a new customer segment. The lights in the room reflected on the interested faces of my colleagues. Almost everyone was eager to hear the ideas I brought to the table. But looking at Mark, I realized he wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on the projector, as if the screen could offer an escape from the pressure I exerted on his position. Tiffany, beside him, exchanged a quick glance that spoke volumes, a mix of nervousness and displeasure, and there had been several of these meetings, small moments that accumulated. Mark always cut me off with casual comments, certainly to belittle my proposals. "Claire, we need to be realistic," he'd say, shaking his head with subtle disdain. And I fought against the frustration, looking for ways to convince him, trying not to seem desperate. After all, I was there to create and innovate, not to be seen as a threat. Now, recalling these episodes, I was amazed at how subtle yet impactful these conflicts were. Each glance exchanged between Mark and Tiffany was a password that prevented me from moving forward. They had united in a silent alliance, a resistant force that rejected any change I could bring. It was a power play disguised as camaraderie, and I was always the outsider, the intruder who didn't understand the how and why of their mundane work style. The weeks after my dismissal passed in a blur of frustration and reflection. I mentally revisited the projects I had worked on, each built with the sweat of my brow and sleepless nights. My history in the industry wasn't just a list of accomplishments, but a testament to my strength and resilience. I remembered how, during an internal workshop, I was approved to manage a company mobile device budget, where my research and recommendations on user needs were accepted. This was a small triumph, but it was my first sign that I could make a difference. What Mark never realized was that each small victory pushed me to be more determined. Through it all, anger wasn't my only companion. There was also a deep sense of injustice that I needed to transform. Life hadn't prepared me to sit and lament. I was determined, and the entrepreneurial spirit I had nurtured would finally have its chance. Instead of crumbling, I channeled that pain into fuel. The tech sector I specialized in was dynamic, engaging, and above all, brimming with opportunities. I started making a list of my contacts. Many nights were spent revisiting former colleagues, people who respected my work and would be surprised to hear about my dismissal. My focus was always the same, to show that even in the face of adversity, I wasn't finished. This was just the beginning of something big. In one of those calls, I spoke with Alex, a former colleague now involved in a successful startup. He had always admired my vision, and upon hearing about my idea for a new company, his enthusiasm was immediate. He offered to help with his crowdfunding expertise and connected me with potential investors. Every word filled me with hope and renewed my sense of purpose. Meanwhile, my mind stayed sharp. I knew planning was crucial. I started sketching a business model, things I'd always kept hidden inside. I created charts, wrote notes in a notebook that was now becoming my idea journal. Each filled page was one step closer to what should be a real project. Furthermore, I realized it was important to have a distinct name for my startup, something that reflected the innovation and boldness I had cultivated. The name had to be like a flag, hoisted high to show the world that Claire hadn't been defeated. With that said, I left the anger behind. Revenge wasn't what I sought, but the affirmation of my value and the answer to the underestimation imposed by those who ganged up against me. It was time to go back to the drawing board and create something that not only valued my vision, but also changed the perspective of everyone who had ever doubted me. The journey was just beginning. I was no longer a shadow, but a proactive force, ready to make my mark on the world. After my dismissal, the energy that once consumed me began to transform into focus and determination. My mind was clear, and like a chess player, I needed to plan each move. The first step toward my new trajectory was understanding how I could finance my startup. The idea of crowdfunding began to take shape. I knew that relying on traditional investors was risky. It could compromise my vision. Crowdfunding, on the other hand, was a way to build a community around my idea, inviting people who believed in innovations to join me. With the help of Alex, a former colleague, I began studying crowdfunding platforms and strategies to attract investors. The nights became long, filled with notes and brainstorming sessions. With a cup of coffee as my companion, each page of my notebook filled with ideas, persuasive charts, and sketches of what would become my business plan. This notebook transformed into a map for my new entrepreneurial life, a repository of hope and determination. In addition, I realized that validating my idea was essential, so I decided to contact former colleagues and hear their opinions. Carla, a former marketing manager I worked with, always had an innovative approach. Upon hearing about my idea, the sparkle in her eyes was contagious. Claire, this could be exactly what the market needs. Let's put together a business plan together. she suggested. This kind of collaboration ignited a flame within me. I started assembling a team composed of people who believed in me and the idea. One of these contacts was a lawyer specializing in startups who could help me formalize the business. The feeling of being surrounded by allies was a release valve, solidifying my desire to show that my vision was viable. However, I realized that the path would still be challenging. The resistance I felt from Mark and Tiffany always lingered in my mind, but now it became a motivator. With each meeting, each conversation, the idea that once existed as a sketch began to come to life. I conducted market research and understood that the gaps I had always wanted to fill were even wider than I imagined. Technology and innovation were at my doorstep, and I had the ability to explore this. A plan began to emerge, and I decided to use social media as a platform to present my concept. The internet was a fertile ground for innovation, and I decided that my story needed to be told. With Carla by my side, I prepared an initial post that addressed my dream and the reasons that led me to create it. This statement would be a way to show that I wasn't just a victim, but a woman determined to challenge the status quo. The reaction was surprising. As the views increased, my confidence increased in equal measure. That was a sign that other people also saw value in my project, which reinforced my conviction in the journey ahead. With this growing support, I contacted potential investors. It was a unique opportunity, and the first meeting was scheduled for soon. Nervousness mixed with determination. Adrenaline coursed through my body as I prepared the presentation, endowing each slide with enthusiasm and certainty. I made sure to include market analyses, clear definitions of what would make my idea unique, and above all, how it would address the gaps I had identified. This wasn't just a plan, it was an anecdote about overcoming my challenges and the value I could bring to the market. Now, I was about to take a decisive step in building my future. The shadows of Mark and Tiffany wouldn't be an obstacle anymore. I was in control, and with each step towards this new reality, my dream became more tangible. The time for payback had begun, not in the way they expected, but as a rebirth promising something grand. I was Claire, and this was just the first step of my journey. As the day of my presentation drew closer, every moment was filled with excitement and intensity. The adrenaline that was previously a source of nervousness now transformed into fuel. With each new idea, my plan for the startup became more solid. What at first seemed like a distant dream was now taking concrete form. I knew that before presenting my project, I needed a deep understanding of the market. A competitor analysis was necessary. In doing so, I realized there was more resistance than I imagined. Established companies realized that new voices, like mine, could threaten their empire. This understanding ignited the flame of determination within me. I was determined not to be just another player in the market. I wanted to be a force to be reckoned with. My research led me to conduct informal interviews with people who could become part of my target audience. I wanted to understand their needs, their desires, and the gaps they felt in the current market. I organized small focus groups where they could share their concerns and hopes. Each session brought me valuable insights, painting a broader picture of how my startup could meet these demands. But as I delved deeper into my investigation, I began to perceive a trap involving a broader concept. The resistance might not only come from the market, but from attitudes more deeply rooted in the industry's culture. Mark and Tiffany were merely representatives of the fear that many companies have when confronted with innovation. I thought about how I could model my company, not only to break with old expectations, but also to create a safe space for experimentation and change. A fundamental aspect I identified was the need to differentiate myself not only by my idea, but by how I would run the business. My startup would need an organizational culture that prioritized creativity and controlled risk. What I could offer was an environment where every collaborator felt comfortable expressing opinions without fear of reprisal. I shared these reflections in a meeting with Carla, who was as excited as I was about the idea of an innovative space. These moments of reflection helped me understand that I wasn't just creating a product, but a new lifestyle and work style that many sought. The culture I intended to implement would be an extension of my own transformational journey. This human approach alongside the business would become one of the central pillars of my presentation. I also needed to think about how Mark and Tiffany would react to this rise. I knew that simply reading about my success wouldn't please them. As I prepared, I visualized the scene, them watching me from afar, trying to dismiss my value as a mere whim. I was overcome by a mix of determination and excitement. They had underestimated me and were about to witness the building of something lasting and significant. 2 days before the presentation, my anxiety reached its peak. All my efforts focused on how I had discovered and shaped a viable concept. But what worried me most was not just impressing the investors, but also establishing a dialogue about how I could bring real change to the industry. My presentation needed to be clear and captivating, using accessible yet professional language. When the day finally arrived, the room was full of potential investors, all with varied expressions, some anxious, others skeptical. They all waited to see if the woman who was once fired actually had something to offer. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I presented myself before that audience. The initial fear faded, quickly replaced by the certainty that I had something powerful in my hands. I began my presentation with a brief narrative about my journey, sharing the challenges I faced. I spoke not only about myself, but about a larger movement. My goal was to spark an emotional connection. How many of them had felt like an outsider on their own journeys? How much did they want to see changes in their own realities? As I went through the presentation, the connection began to solidify. I showed market data, illustrations of how the lack of innovation was harming not only companies, but the very evolution of the industry. Each chart and statistic I presented was a defense not only of my idea, but of the need for change. As the presentation unfolded, my words began to flow smoothly. I felt the energy transform in the air. The reactions were palpable. Eyes lit up as I spoke passionately. What was meant to be a product transformed in their eyes into an opportunity to be part of a revolution. When I finished, there was an expectation in the air. Several hands went up, each holding a question or comment. This was exactly what I had imagined. A dialogue. Not just a sale, but a conversation, an invitation to get involved. I answered each question with confidence, highlighting not only the viability of my project, but its importance in creating a sustainable and innovative environment. The aftermath of the presentation became a milestone in my journey. The raised hands seeking clarification transformed into proposals. Some investors invited the team to lunch, while others showed immediate interest in our initiative. It was the recognition I always sought, and a feeling of empowerment filled the air. In the following days, each meeting became a new chapter of my story. Claire, by my side, skillfully navigated the discussions. Throughout each encounter, we refined our proposal and adjusted the business model, always attentive to the suggestions and demands emerging from our potential partners. What was an initial idea now became a robust project, surrounded by committed allies. My prior market research allowed me to anticipate investors' concerns. My subsequent presentations included even more detailed information about the sector and our competitive advantage. We emphasized the need for an innovative approach, focusing not only on profit, but also on creating social impact. Our pitches became more compelling, and each new meeting brought more confidence. One investor who stood out was Lucas, a veteran in the tech sector, whose combined experience and vision provided the weight our startup needed. He saw in us the potential to bring about significant changes that went beyond financial metrics. In one of our conversations, he stressed, companies that don't innovate, that don't adapt, are doomed to fail. The true skill is knowing when to reinvent yourself. His insight resonated with me. This wasn't just about growth and profit, it was about sparking a cultural shift in the industry. As we built a network of investors and partners, I realized my vision was taking shape. We assembled a team that combined diverse skills, from marketing to technology development. It was a remarkable moment. We were shaping not just a product, but a new way of working, a collaborative culture that prioritized creativity. However, with growth came challenges. Mark and Tiffany weren't a distant memory, but a worrying reality. I knew they were watching closely and that the market dominance they had built for so long wouldn't yield easily. During a strategic meeting, while discussing expanding our digital presence, my phone vibrated. It was a message from a former colleague who still worked there. He sent a link to a post on a business news platform announcing a new market strategy from the old company and implicitly mentioning the need for innovation as a response to growing competition. The article reeked of desperation, a reflection of their concern. Mark and Tiffany were aware of what we were doing and were taking steps to adopt the very changes I proposed. What could initially be interpreted as praise quickly became a battle. If they were watching, it was time to act and respond decisively. I'd learned to gather information and use it to my advantage. With Lucas's help and the team, we developed a marketing campaign that not only promoted our product, but also subtly compared it to what the old company offered. For months, we created content that highlighted the competition's weaknesses in an elegant and persuasive way. It wasn't betrayal, but a smart strategy. I was willing to share my vision and show that we weren't just a threat, but the evolution of the market. Our sales started to grow, and the crowdfunding campaign exceeded expectations. With each new contribution, my self-confidence expanded. It was the validation of a dream that wasn't just reborn, but thrived in a planned and methodical way. During this period, meetings with potential investors became increasingly frequent, all aligned with the expectation of an official launch further down the line. However, all these victories didn't stop Mark and Tiffany from attempting a counteroffensive. I knew the moment of confrontation was approaching. During a highly important meeting, Mark rose to defend his side, attacking our approaches and downplaying our growth. He spoke with utmost confidence, trying not to appear desperate. Companies that launch themselves into new ideas without solid footing are nothing more than a passing fad, he said with a smug smile. I listened, with a serene smile on my face. Change is a constant in our industry, Mark. If you're not reinventing yourself, you're defining your own extinction. We were in the era of the tyranny of control, and now it's time for the freedom of innovation, I replied, measuring each word. The flicker of surprise in his expression was gratifying. I had scored a point. The months had transformed the power dynamic. While Mark and Tiffany were clinging to a past that kept them at a distance, I was surrounded by a new team, willing to blaze new trails. I could see their deeper frustrations, a mixture of fear and insecurity at relinquishing the control they'd always had. They would need to adapt or be left behind. The auditorium buzzed with excited murmurs and whispers, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. My heart pounded, each beat resonating through my body as a reminder of how much this day meant. I was about to present not just a product, but a vision, the culmination of a journey that had begun with betrayal and loneliness and now blossomed into innovation and empowerment. When the lights dimmed, a profound silence enveloped the room. I positioned myself center stage, under the spotlight, my determined figure highlighted. Thank you all for being here. My name is Claire, and I'm the founder of Startup Name. Today, we're not just launching a new product, we're starting a revolution in how we interact with our industry. I began, captivating everyone's attention with passion. I strategically used market data, presenting graphs that highlighted the industry's need for transformation. My words flowed with confidence and clarity. With each slide, I emphasized that we were ready to challenge the established norms. What was once a distant dream was now palpable in the form of innovation. As my presentation unfolded, I noticed many faces in the audience reflecting curiosity and excitement. The emotional connection I sought was established. I saw approving glances, a gleam showing I wasn't alone on this journey. Concluding, I left a final message resonating. We're here to build a legacy that transcends trends, an impact that will continue to reverberate. The auditorium erupted in applause. After the presentation, a wave of conversations and congratulations washed over me. Investors and partners approached with enthusiasm, ready to join our movement. The warmth of support at my back was overwhelming. But, glancing towards the back of the room, I spotted Mark and Tiffany observing, their faces etched with disbelief and frustration. They were reminders of a past I was determined to leave behind. The following week, I maintained my focus on meetings with investors and partners, capitalizing on the waves of interest generated by my presentation. However, as success began to materialize, Mark and Tiffany weren't willing to accept it. They launched a negative campaign on a business blog, insinuating that our innovation was merely an attack on the traditional practices they championed. A concerned former colleague alerted me to what was happening. "They're trying to discredit your idea, Claire. They're saying you don't have what it takes to survive in the market." With that, I realized I needed to act. I gathered my team to discuss marketing tactics that would become our response. We need to reaffirm our position. What we're doing isn't a passing fad, but an urgent necessity. We'll show we have the legitimacy we've earned, I declared, fixing my gaze on each team member. Thus, we initiated a communication strategy that not only refuted Mark and Tiffany's claims, but also affirmed our mission and vision. We began creating content that chronicled our journey and highlighted the importance of innovation in the industry. Blog posts, interviews, and a renewed social media presence became tools to assert our power. While we faced this challenge, sales continued to grow, and audience feedback was positive. The message was being heard, and the strength of our narrative became even more evident. The resistance Mark and Tiffany tried to impose only fueled our determination to move forward. The battle for our brand's legitimacy lasted months. Every new comparison they tried to throw at us, we answered with the progress we had made. The effective marketing strategy and the strengthening of our organizational culture became evident, and that made all the difference. We were shaping something grand and authentic. One evening, while strategizing for a more robust launch, I received a message from Lucas. "We secured a spot at the next tech conference. We'll present our innovations." It was the perfect opportunity to demonstrate our growth. I knew we needed to deliver an impactful presentation, highlighting not only what we did, but also challenging the criticisms those who opposed us tried to expose. In the following days, I meticulously prepared for the conference. The presentation needed to be flawless, and I had an irresistible desire to impact the audience. The goal wasn't just to sell an idea, but to touch minds and hearts. The event became a stage not only for our brand, but for revenge against the uncertainties I had witnessed in the past. When the day of the conference arrived, I found myself surrounded by prominent industry figures and influencers eager to learn about new ideas. As the room filled, my adrenaline surged. I remembered the hardships and challenges I had faced. As I stepped onto the stage, determination consumed me. Block 6, the presentation. Today, I'm not just here to present an innovative product. I'm here to share a vision of a more collaborative and inclusive future, I began, and saw curious glances turn towards me. The feedback was immediate. I continued, presenting even more robust data and evidence, reaffirming the need for change. With each slide, the enthusiasm grew. When I finished, I was again met with enthusiastic applause. The audience's minds were clearly open. Comments began to emerge, and positive energy vibrated through the air. But there was something else. In the crowd, I spotted Mark and Tiffany among the guests. They were there, but stiff and with grim expressions. Even amidst the success, I couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction as I watched my journey unfold. What was once a symbol of oppression was now struggling to find its place in the new landscape. By the end of the conference, I realized how resistance had become a driving force. The determination that emerged from an internal battle became my true victory. I had not only overcome obstacles, I was building a future that didn't depend on looking back, but projected forward. In the end, I realized that our impact not only challenged old norms, but also invited others to rise up and join us. Now, more than ever, I was ready to call the shots. After the conference, the atmosphere around my startup was electrically charged with optimism. Positive feedback flooded my inbox, and partnership opportunities began to emerge in a constant stream. What impressed me even more was how people's perception of my journey had drastically changed. From someone underestimated, I was now seen as a visionary leader, capable of inspiring others to find their own voices. In this new context, I realized my responsibility went beyond profit. I wanted to create a legacy that empowered those who, like me, had faced hardships. The feeling of shaping a more inclusive future was, without a doubt, more rewarding than any financial triumph. As the team grew, so did the need for a collaborative environment. I held frequent meetings to listen to ideas and concerns, establishing a space where everyone felt comfortable sharing their opinions. The importance of diverse thinking was never clearer to me, especially when one of our new interns, Louisa, proposed an idea that initially seemed simple. After discussion, it transformed into the foundation of a feature that revolutionized how customers interacted with our product. These experiences demonstrated not only the value of collaboration, but also showed that I was building something bigger. What was once a startup was now becoming a community of innovators, willing to challenge norms and leave their mark. However, the past wasn't entirely buried. Mark and Tiffany, unable to accept our rise, launched a negative campaign on industry blogs, insinuating that our innovation was just an attack on their legacy. This left me intrigued and, at the same time, determined to face the challenge. When a former colleague alerted me to the situation, I realized it was time to act. I gathered my team, and we decided our response would be proactive. Let's show that what we do isn't a passing fad, but an urgent necessity, I declared. We launched a communication campaign to refute their claims and reaffirm our mission. We created content that not only detailed our journey, but also highlighted the importance of innovation. Social media posts, interviews, and a renewed presence were key to reinforcing our narrative. As progress continued, sales began to increase. The public's acceptance was encouraging, and our message began to resonate. The resistance that Mark and Tiffany were trying to impose was only fueling our determination. After months of intense public and private battles, I was invited to a panel of industry leaders. This was my chance to reaffirm our impact and direction. As I stepped onto the stage, I felt it wasn't just a presentation, it was an empowerment mission. Each of us has the power to shape the future. When we unite, we are an unstoppable force, I began, and the audience seemed to absorb every word. The conference was a milestone. When I finished, I was met with enthusiastic applause and questions. The dialogue was open, and the storms generated by Mark and Tiffany began to subside as a new light shone. The journey transformed me, and I realized that instead of focusing on revenge, I was creating a space that celebrated every voice. It was time to not only overcome obstacles, but also to foster a future in which everyone could thrive. I was ready to call the shots, and those shadows of the past were no longer a burden, but a testament to resilience. So, looking back at the path I'd traveled, I realized that the true victory wasn't just about conquering the market, but about inspiring change and being part of a movement that wouldn't conform. I appreciated the strength that emerged from that internal battle and the certainty that the future was still a vast horizon full of possibilities.